Great. Well, I think we can get started. I see we have quite a few participants joining us already. And welcome, Helene. I'll welcome everybody formally now. Welcome to Perspectives on Philanthropy. These are conversations that provide context. It is a series that seeks perspective on the world of philanthropy as we enter the pandemic, how we have pivoted to deal with its urgency, how we might be raising our sights to peer into the world that might emerge, and how we can participate in creating what it will look like. Since we started this series in May, we have witnessed an upsurge of protests for racial justice after the killing of George Floyd. The philanthropic response to the protests has also been remarkable, engaging a broad swath of the American population, even reaching beyond our shores. The newly amplified quest for racial justice has added a new dimension to our time of crisis. At the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, we believe that curiosity-based research and scholarship on the field is illuminating, and we also seek to connect rigorous research to the vital insights of practitioners. Engaging practitioners and leaders in the field works to advance knowledge and to improve practice, and we are very pleased to be able to share these conversations. We think that following one's curiosity is not only its own reward, but that it can lead to more thoughtful and effective voluntary action and systematic generosity. We are extremely pleased today and honored to have as our guest Helene Gayle, President and CEO of the Chicago Community Trust, and a distinguished visiting fellow at our school. She was last with us in person in October of 2018, how long ago that seems, when she helped us open the speaker series that launched our May's Family Institute on Diverse Philanthropy. We are also pleased that Dr. Gayle serves on the advisory council of our Charles Stewart Mott Foundation Chair on Community Foundations. The Chicago Community Trust is one of the nation's oldest and largest community foundations. Since Helene took over its leadership in 2017, the Trust has adopted a new strategic focus on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap in the Chicago region. For almost a decade, she was president and CEO of CARE, a leading international humanitarian organization. An expert on global development, humanitarian, and health issues, Dr. Gayle spent 20 years with the CDC, working primarily on HIV/AIDS. She worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, directing programs on HIV/AIDS and other global health issues. She also launched the Mckinsey Social Initiative, now mckinsey.org, a nonprofit that builds partnerships for social impact. Dr. Gayle serves on public company and nonprofit boards, including the Coca-Cola Company, Colgate-Palmolive Company, Brookings Institution, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, New America Foundation, the One Campaign, the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and the Economic Club of Chicago as well. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the American Public Health Association, the National Academy of Medicine, the National Medical Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. Not surprisingly, with this wonderful background, she was named one of Forbes' 100 Most Powerful Women and one of Nonprofit Time's Power and Influence Top 50. She has authored numerous articles on global and domestic public health issues, poverty alleviation, gender equality, and social justice. She was born and raised in Buffalo, New York, and has a BA in psychology from Barnard College, an MD from the University of Pennsylvania, and an MPH from Johns Hopkins. She has received 18 honorary degrees and holds faculty appointments at the University of Washington and Emory University. As you see, we are truly privileged to have someone with her wonderful background with us today. Helene, welcome to Perspectives on Philanthropy.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Wonderful. I will start with a few questions before we turn it to our audience for our discussion. Reflecting on our moment, you wrote with some passion a couple of months ago as follows, and I'm quoting you: "We cannot be a nation that cares more about the destruction of property than the destruction of people. We will fix the broken buildings, but will we fix our broken spirits?" Tell us how you view our moment and our potential to meet the challenge of responding to the calls for greater racial justice.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think this is a very important moment in our nation's history in many ways. And, as I reflected on the many months that we have been tackling with COVID-19 and the fact that it highlighted some of the inequities that exist, as we saw it particularly impacting Black and Brown communities in the nation. And then as you mentioned, on top of that, the murder of George Floyd and, the outpouring of, in many ways, just the sense of indignation around seeing this incredibly brutal act take place in front of our very eyes. I think it did, while I think coronavirus and the impact that it had kind of woke us up to some of the inequities, I think that what happened with George Floyd kind of stiffened our resolve, if you will, to actually tackle that. And, I do believe that something came out of that different than I've felt in a long time. And, even being a young adolescent during the civil rights movement, I felt like this was really different, that this was a multiracial, multi-generational coalition of people who really were saying, enough is enough. And we feel like it's time to really tackle the issues which are systemic and make a difference in a way that I think we haven't thought about and talked about before. And, obviously the issue of the looting and buildings that were destroyed, and, people probably saw just a couple of days ago here in Chicago, we had another rash of looting and destruction. And obviously, that's not a good thing by any means. It destroys property. It makes people concerned about, coming into our downtown, et cetera. But, so much of that anger that pours over is as a result of decades and decades of people feeling like their lives didn't matter. And so I think this kind of shift that we're seeing, which I hope is not just a momentary outcry and outpouring, but I think it really does have a more sustained feel to it. I hope that this is a moment where we really do think about how do we change the systemic barriers and obstacles that have left many of our citizens out of the ability to realize their full potential, and how do we really address those issues? And the fact that people are starting to talk about this as systemic and not as an individual issue, I think encourages me that perhaps we'll actually get to the root causes of some of these issues in a way that perhaps we haven't tackled before.
Well, that's great to hear you say that. Just at our university and our school, we've seen a lot of energy. A group of our doctoral students really want us to address this and see what we could do to be more systemic in our response to kind of systemic racism as well.
Yeah, and I mean, just to say, I think part of it that is encouraging is that it's not just coming from, the nonprofit or the social impact sector. It is universities, it's corporations, as well as governments who are all talking about this. And I think when our whole society starts saying that we all have a role to play, that it isn't just government's problem, or it isn't just the university's problems, or it isn't just nonprofits' problem, that we all have a role in this, that I think we can really start to see sustained change.
Absolutely. That's a hopeful way to see this moment. Certainly with the reading list, you see what people are picking up off bookshelves to try to inform themselves. And
right.
We're trying to do the same things. But before this moment, the trust, the Chicago Community Trust, had already established a new strategic direction, a moonshot, as you have called it at the trust. And the aim was to close the racial and wealth gap in Chicago. How has this moonshot been affected by the racial awakening that we are seeing now?
Well, I think it really put us in some ways in a really good position to lean into this moment. We had developed this strategy and launched it about a year ago because we felt that, if you looked at a lot of the challenges that we face here in the region, whether it's violence or health disparity, education, et cetera, underneath that, the root cause is really this large and growing wealth gap that exists that is particularly pronounced for the African American and Latinx communities here. And for us as a region, and particularly the city, metropolitan Chicago, 2/3 of the population are Black and Latinx. If you hold back 2/3 of your population's potential, it is not numerically possible to move forward in the way that we should as a region. So we know that, it is the right thing and the fair thing to do, but it also makes sense if we want to see economic progress in our region. So we said, let's look at the ways in which you can tackle the wealth gap. And, with COVID, which highlighted the racial disparity, and then George Floyd, which, as I said, kind of, I think, stiffened our resolve, we were able to lean into this moment, if you will, because it really called out in many ways the urgency for really tackling these issues. And so, I think we were well prepared to really respond to the COVID crisis, as well as the response to the George Floyd murder, because we had already started along that road of looking at what are the things that you can do both programmatically with our dollars, but also how can we influence policies that can impact this racial and ethnic wealth gap, which we now see even more pronounced as a result of COVID.
Well, so let me ask you about, the trust is one of the oldest and largest community foundations, and but still the moonshot is a big lift, so to speak. I mean,
Yes,
this is a structural
right.
problem. So who will you engage? How are you going to influence policy changes? Who will you try to walk along with to make these changes? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you exactly right. The Chicago Community Trust can't do it alone, nor can philanthropy. All of philanthropy really make the kinds of changes that need to happen. I think what we can do is to demonstrate what works, and we've developed some specific areas that we will focus on around increasing household wealth, catalyzing investment in underinvested and disinvested neighborhoods, and elevating community voice. So those are kind of our three streams, if you will, where we want to be able to do the kinds of programs that demonstrate what works and starts to show that you can make a difference. But those programs need to be sustained, beyond what we can do. So we're partnering with other philanthropy. We're partnering with our public sector, and we're also working with our corporations, because obviously, if you look at things like workforce development, you need to have the public sector, the private sector involved, or investment in neighborhoods where there's been under investment. We need to have the private sector involved. So, we really are looking at how do we both fund programs that can make a difference, but also bring partners to the table so that we can move together in an aligned fashion. And then, third, really looking at public policy. And, we really have put a big focus on how can we influence policies that can make a difference. As an example, earned income tax credit is a hugely successful program that has really helped to provide some measure of financial stability to working families. But there's lots of ways in which that could be expanded and improved as a program. And so we're looking at programs that, provide financial security, that look at policies that can help things like predatory lending, as an example, because we also know that, one of the things that, while we want to increase wealth, you also have to think about the things that strip wealth. So we've put a big focus on debt as well, and looking at some of the things that can help some of the predatory practices that put greater strain on families who already have limited assets. So, we're working both as a grant maker, but then how do we influence things as a change maker? And how can we also move from only thinking about our assets as being our dollars to thinking about how do we convene others, influence the direction, and then use our voice, if you will, to influence the policy lens.
That's great. Well, thank you for that insight. Let's return a little bit to the current moment. And I'd like to refer to some of the research that our Mott Chair, Professor Lori Paulberg, has done about the kind of the extent of the community philanthropy response to the pandemic. She has found that since the pandemic and through June 30th, COVID-19 relief funds at local United Ways and community foundations across the U.S. raised more than $1 billion and distributed at least 589 million to financially vulnerable individuals and nonprofits leading the pandemic response. And she has found that over 1,000 such organizations support COVID-19 funds, and 244 of them are jointly supported in partnership with at least one neighboring United Way or community foundations. Tell us a little bit about the COVID-19 response of the trust in the context of the Chicagoland philanthropic community.
Yes, and so we're part of that trend that she described. We, along with our United Way Metropolitan Chicago, mounted a fund very quickly in middle of March, when we first realized that this was going to be a serious challenge. And we benefited from the fact that our community foundation and United Way colleagues in Seattle had launched a similar effort just a few days before. As you remember, they were the first to start reporting deaths. So Seattle was kind of a harbinger in many ways. And so we took a page from their playbook, and we, along with our partners from United Way of Chicago, developed a fund. We launched that fund with about $10 million, and within a couple of weeks, we had already raised over $30 million. We also helped to support a similar fund at the state level, which also, again, raised over $30 million. And we quickly launched those funds and were able to rapidly deploy resources. We've now funded over 350 single organizations, and really focusing on the things that people needed the most during this crisis, particularly in the early days. We focused on food, we focused on shelter, we focused on getting cash out to people so that they could pay their bills and stay in their homes, et cetera, and really work to both fund organizations that could most rapidly respond, large food banks that could get food to people throughout the region. But also we wanted to make sure that we were getting dollars into small local organizations that really knew the needs of their population, with a big focus on the Black and Latinx communities, because we soon realized early on how it was unfolding and how it was having a disproportionate impact on those communities that were already financially insecure and were now being most hard hit by this pandemic. So, we were, I think, rapid to ramp up, and also feel good that we were able to get services out rapidly to communities that were most hard hit.
And what do you see as the sustainability of that? I mean, now that we're in months and months, and the crisis seems to be extended, and there's some question about kind of, the extent of the federal continuity of support for, people in terms of evictions and people getting unemployment and things like that. Are you challenged to maintain the intensity of the support?
Well, I think, we will look at that and see, whether or not we'll need to ramp up. We're close to the end of the resources that we had during this first phase of the fund. But again, I think we will do kind of a 1-2 punch, both thinking about what we can do directly, as well as how can we influence some of the things that could make a difference in terms of federal appropriations that could make a big difference. We know that it is the large federal appropriations that have made the biggest difference. And so, we're also looking at how we can continue to push on those efforts as well. We have started thinking about how we pivot to recovery, because, we don't expect, and we've been fortunate that our state and local officials have really been very, have really taken this seriously, let me say. And I think we have while we have started to see cases increasing over these summer months, I think we aren't going to go back to the high peaks that we had in April, May. So I think now we're starting to really think more about how do we help with the recovery process and make sure that recovery has a lens of equity to it, because we know from the recession of 2008, poor communities, particularly Black and Latinx in our region, never really fully recovered. And we don't want to see that happen again. So we're really now looking at, can we mount an effort that is an even larger and longer term effort to make sure that the recovery keeps in mind those who were left behind before, who entered into this pandemic in an economically vulnerable position, and put a real focus on those communities so that we have a more equitable recovery and we actually build back better, if you will, so that those communities are even more resilient than when they entered into this pandemic.
That's great. I think that's a wonderful goal. I just want to remind our participants that the way we're receiving your questions is by, if you would type them into the question and answer box. A couple of people are raising their hands and we have no way of responding to that. So please put your questions in the question and answer box. Helene, we're fortunate that you're also a foremost leading expert on public health, and public health is, what got us into this or a public health crisis. So, given your experience at the CDC, the Gates Foundation, and CARE, how would you characterize philanthropy's response to the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I think philanthropy has really stepped up in many ways. You mentioned, for instance, the fact that philanthropy, particularly community foundations, have come together with partners like the United Way to mount a response to this pandemic. But I think more broadly, philanthropy has really looked at how to step up. Our partners in philanthropy across the nation are increasing their spend rates. They're spending above the 5% minimum that they need to spend, so that in fact they can be more generous, get more support to organizations that have been so hard hit by this pandemic. And so I see, philanthropy actually ramping up to meet this moment. In addition, I think, I think more and more philanthropic organizations see themselves working in partnership, understanding that philanthropy can't do it alone, but in partnership, we can accomplish a great amount. And if we use our voice in the public policy realm, and I see, more and more philanthropy thinking about how it can support advocacy and how can it support public policy changes that could make a big difference as well. So I think that both in terms of the focus on the pandemic, the increased spending, the greater focus on partnership, coupled with thinking more about how we can influence public policy, I think philanthropy is stepping up in ways that the moment demands.
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely not business as usual. So
right.
That's
yeah.
positive to see. Let's turn to the broader context, because the virus isn't limited to the United States, and you've had this great experience internationally as well. One of our former board chairs, Bob Carter, recently helped the World Health Organization create a foundation, which it's probably going to need now that the U.S. has left the World Health Organizations. So I was just wondering, given philanthropy's also historical role in building our international public health infrastructure, what is your perspective on the international dynamics of the response to the virus?
Well, unfortunately, it hasn't been as coordinated as I think it ideally would have. And I think a large part of that is that the United States hasn't played its traditional role as a leader in global health and as a leader in the world community. I think in any pandemic like this, global collaboration is critical. This is not something that's just happening in one part of the world, it's happening all over the world. And I think it's, this is the time more than ever where we need to support organizations like the World Health Organization. It's not perfect, but it is the organization that we entrust to be able to pull nations together. And I think the fact that we're pulling away at the time when we are needed the most is unfortunate. So, you can't control a global pandemic without having global collaboration. So, my hope is that we will continue to push and make sure that we can move back in a direction where the United States takes the kind of global role that it should. When I was at the CDC, many of the lead organizations within WHO were actually headed by people who were on loan from CDC. There's always been this incredible collaborative relationship between the United States and other global health bodies, and we need to get back to that.
Right. It's unfortunate to see the virus as a source and a part of a conflict among countries and deepening conflicts rather than the cooperation that all the public health experts, I think, including yourself, say is really needed for us to manage this very well. So,
but if we can break it, we can fix it.
There you go. That's great. That's a more positive way of looking at it. There's still hope to kind of reconstitute our multilateral organizations that we need to help us for future pandemics. I would.
Yeah, and I would just say, the collaboration is so deep, and it's been so many decades and generations that I think, at the right moment when we have the right opening, I don't think it will be hard to go back to that kind of collaboration.
Great. Well, that's hopeful. We're all waiting for the vaccine, and we're fortunate to have you co-chairing a committee of the National Academies on a framework for equitable allocation of vaccine for the novel coronavirus. As a lay observer, it seems to me sometimes that the various countries and companies that are pushing forward the vaccine is a very kind of a free-for-all almost. So what will this committee seek to accomplish, and kind of how should we be looking at the various kind of attempts to create a new vaccine?
Had I known when I said yes to taking on this task how complex it was, I'm not sure I would have raised my hand. But anyway, it's obviously incredibly important. And, I think the challenge at this moment is we need some guidelines so that when a vaccine is available, and I think it's probably reasonable to expect that there will be a somewhat effective vaccine, probably in the first quarter of 2021. It's always hard to make these estimates, but if everything continues on course, it's likely that we would have something that is relatively effective, by that time. That said, there's so many unknowns. How effective will it be? How many doses will it need? How many vaccine candidates will we have? So there's a whole bucket of things that are still very much unknown about the properties of the vaccine. Will it mainly impact illness and morbidity, or will it have an impact on transmission as well? I think, so there's a lot of unknowns. So all that to say, we're trying to do the best that we can with a lot of uncertainties to come up with how would you prioritize once there is a vaccine, who gets it first, what will have the greatest overall societal impact, and how to make those decisions, and what's the right framework to use. So those are the kinds of things we're grappling with at a moment where there's a fair amount of unknowns and a fair amount of uncertainties. And as always, when you're trying to make decisions, when you are balancing uncertainties, and when you're talking about something that has such a huge impact, it's not an easy task.
No, but well, thank you for taking that on. That does seem like
Yeah, and I just, I guess I would just say, I think, when you really do have to think about what are your values, what are your principles, and what will be the things that guide your decision making so that you're consistent. Because I think what the public wants more than anything is something that is understandable, that is transparent, and that has some consistency in the logic, even if people might disagree with the final recommendations. At least if we can create a coherent story of why we're recommending what we're recommending and what were the principles that went into it.
Yeah. Are you worried about, in this context, kind of the anti-vaccine movement that has taken on some energy over the last several decades?
Yeah, I think there's this whole literature of vaccine hesitancy, if you will, and I think there's two um, you know, basic components to that. One are the people who are the quote anti-vaxxers who, for a variety of reasons, um, don't believe in the science of vaccination. Um, but there's also, I think, another hesitancy that we worry a lot about. One, people do worry about the speed of the development. Anytime you talk about a project as Operation Warp Speed and you're talking about a biologic product, it gets people worrying. And so I think, one, we have to make it clear why, in fact, this is a valid scientific process that is being undertaken and why we feel there shouldn't be concern. So I think that needs to be clearer and spelled out. And then I think there's also a group of people who have had historic mistrust of science, health, medicine, and how they have been treated in the medical system. And those tend to be people of color, people who have had historical reasons for mistrust of the medical establishment. And now those are also the very same people who are most impacted by the COVID pandemic. So we've got a lot of challenges around the whole issue of public trust in this vaccine, of which the anti-vaxxers are one. But I think, there's also the general public that just wonders about this very rapid development. And then there are people who have had historic reasons for mistrust of, the medical establishment.
Right. Well, let me turn to some of the questions that our participants are asking too. And one has something to do with the kind of historical reasons for mistrust. And this is one of our participants asks, in a lot of ways, some believe that the philanthropic community has fueled the very systems of injustice that you spoke about. What are 2 to 3 changes that you would suggest to institutions to move beyond their quote unquote Black Lives Matter statements to affect and impact sustainable social change?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and it's one that we talk a lot about here at our foundation, and I know it's a discussion that's going on in lots of foundations around the country, and really looking at how do we change the power dynamics in the philanthropic world? How do we do a better job of truly engaging communities that we that we say we serve, and really develop a different kind of partnership with them? And we've been working a lot on how we engage with communities in an authentic way, including having communities starting to even help us define grant programs, help us to even evaluate where dollars are going, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of ways in which you can engage communities as partners in your philanthropic journey. I also think looking at who are we funding. We've put a really big focus on really funding communities, organizations led by people of color in communities of color. There was a series of interesting articles not long ago that talked about somebody described philanthropic redlining, where it's very obvious that white-led nonprofits get funded preferentially when compared to nonprofits that are led by people of color. And so I think we have to look at our own, how do we fund? Do we put an undue burden on communities of color? Do we, does our old boy or old girl network always lead us to the same organizations and not thinking about how we are actually looking at diversity in the way that we do our funding? So, I think there's a lot of ways in which philanthropy is trying to lean into this moment and really think about how we change. Are we, with our own investments, are we using money managers that are people that are firms that are led by people of color? It's one of the big things that philanthropies can do with their endowments is looking at, how are their endowments managed? Are we actually using firms that are led by people of color, et cetera? So I think there's a lot of things that we can do to lean into the moment, look at how we spend, look at how we grant, and looking at the relationships that we develop and how authentic they are and how much are we actually in partnership with the communities that we work with.
Well, I think that's very kind of on the cutting edge of innovation to be more participatory in grant making. We have a couple of questions that are kind of follow up more specifically on this theme, and perhaps it's encapsulated by one of our doctoral students who asks, when funding Black and Latinx-led organizations, some funders raise concerns about giving out large amounts to organizations of smaller size. And that might fit into the kind of the notion of redlining and always giving to the more established and more white-led organizations. So how do you overcome that specific issue of kind of the absorptive capacity of maybe smaller organizations that have not historically been, have not historically invested in their capacity as much as they should have?
Yeah, most large organizations started by being small, and they got big because people funded them. So, there's a lot that we can do to actually develop some of the small organizations. And clearly, oftentimes, some of these smaller organizations need help in developing their capacity. They need help in developing their, core skills and how to run the business of the organization. They often know a lot about how to reach the populations, may not have all that they need, may not be able to support getting a great grant writer, et cetera. So, there are lots of ways in which we can build capacity, and we have had a variety of capacity building programs to do exactly that. Most organizations with the right kind of support, along with dollars, can grow and build their capacity. And so, if we actually believe that, people of color led organizations have the same capacity to grow as a white organization, then we need to make sure that we, position them for success.
Absolutely. I think that's a great response, that, all organizations, no matter how large, began at some point as small ones, and then you have to make those investments. Well, August, let me go back to one of the questions I had from previously. August is also Black Philanthropy Month, and the movement for Black lives is led by marginalized peoples. And as your strategy shows, we know there are significant disparities in terms of wealth between white and minority populations. Yet the research that we've done at the school shows that once you control for wealth, minority populations are at least as generous as white populations. How do you see the future of philanthropy in communities of color and other marginalized populations?
Well, as you mentioned, I think the study shows that there really is no difference. People often look at kind of traditional philanthropy and make those comparisons, but don't then look at the fact that, if you think of philanthropy as giving back, that there are many ways in which communities of color give back. The fact that oftentimes people are responsible for multiple family members at the same time that they're taking care of their own nuclear family, or that communities of color often do a lot of their philanthropy through their church and faith communities. And that, there are a variety of different ways in which people give back broadly, some of it that doesn't get captured in tax, in tax returns. So it doesn't always look as if communities of color are being as generous, but in fact, in many studies, it shows that they are at least as much, if not more, if you look at all the ways in which people give back. I think it will continue to increase because, the other thing, your studies continue to show is that as people's net worth increase, so does their philanthropy. And, as we see, people continuing to have greater economic power, they will also continue to be more philanthropic. So I think that Black giving will continue to increase. And I think, I'm really inspired by seeing the creativity and the range of ways in which the Black community is looking at philanthropy. I mean, we've got some wonderful giving circles here, for instance, that are really doing innovative work with sometimes with small dollars, but really doing it in a way that impacts communities very directly. So, I'm really optimistic about the future of Black philanthropy.
That's great. And speaking of economic power, and as it grows, we have our corporate world is kind of stepping in to express its support for the calls for racial justice. And you have significant experience on corporate boards and helped create a nonprofit for Mckinsey. We see the Business Roundtable proclaiming a new era of stakeholder interests and major companies offering to help with both environmental issues and racial justice. How do you see the social role of business evolving?
Yeah, I think it's critically important. There are kind of two renewable sources of capital in the world. It's either tax revenue or what is pumped out through the public sector. And so I think the public sector has a huge role to play in a variety of different ways. We've seen, particularly most immediately after the murder of George Floyd, companies pledging to really think about their own houses. How are they thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? How are they looking at, getting more people on the pathway to being in the C-suite, or getting more board members of color as part of their board, and looking at some of these issues of how internally are people feeling included within the environment of the corporation. And I think that was a great start. But there's also a lot more that companies can do beyond, kind of the culture within the organization. They can look at how they spend their dollars. There's been a big movement around supplier diversity for decades, but there hasn't been any real accountability around how do you spend your dollars in ways that can help to provide greater economic opportunity. Are you looking at how you're employing, and are you looking at employing from communities that have not had the same economic opportunity? Are you spending dollars with minority firms? There's a lot of research that looks at, even if companies just started spending some percentage more of their dollars in firms that are owned by people of color, professional services firms, and others, that could have a huge impact. Money invested in banks that help minority communities, looking at putting some of your money in Black banks, for example. So I think there's a lot of ways in which companies can shift. And what are you doing on your corporate social responsibility side? Again, right after the aftermath of George Floyd, we saw a lot of corporations getting money into the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, or other organizations that have always stood for racial equity. And so I think that also is a great step in the right direction, but will that be sustained? So I think all of these things are the kinds of things that the private sector can be doing, but I think we have to, in some ways, have some accountability, just like there is for the environmental sustainability efforts, where more and more companies are being dinged, if you will, if they are not really looking at their environmental sustainability. The same thing should be the case for racial justice and equity as we move into, as we move beyond this immediate moment to thinking about how we sustain this.
So do you think there'll be some emergence of some kind of independent watchdogs or research agencies that will scrutinize policies among our corporations?
Well, there might be. I think the investor community is probably the biggest watchdog that corporations have. And it was when the investor community started talking about board diversity, for instance, and how many women did you have on your board, that we started to see real changes in board diversity relative to gender. Environmental sustainability. Again, the investor community stepped up big time and said, we're going to start voting against some of your proxy dishes if you're not actually showing that you're taking environmental sustainability seriously. So I think there's lots of ways in which the systems that are already in place, if they say that looking at these issues of racial justice now are as important as gender diversity on your board or sustainability, having goals around sustainability that are measurable and incorporated into your systems, I think as long as there is some sense that there's some accountability, we can move in that direction. And I think those systems are in place.
Okay, so the racial equity will become part of the ESG, kind of the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we see racial equity as part of the ESG lens, and companies are being held responsible for their ESG goals and actually meeting targets, I think we will see the same sort of movement that we have seen around ESG.
Right. So another question about following up on engaging communities. How can we have more voices from affected communities involved in policy debates?
Yeah, it's not too dissimilar from my answer about small organizations becoming large. We can get communities of color having more to say about the policy debate if we enable them to do that, if we specifically look at programs that help lift the voices of leaders within communities. We're doing that. As an example, we're funding a group of community organizers within communities of color to actually build a network, kind of a community of learning, so that they are better at how they organize, how they get people in their communities to take community action and to raise their voices around the issues that matter the most for their communities. So there's lots of ways of enabling communities to be able to give voice, but some of it, like anything else, it's being intentional about it and recognizing that, we can develop a cadre of civic leaders who are able to speak for themselves, if you will, and raise their voice about the issues that matter the most to them.
Right. Another question that was having to do, not more technical, but more specific in terms of, I guess, imagining if other community foundations wanted to adopt more equitable funding decisions, what are some of the policies and procedures they would need to change from kind of the normal way of top-down grant making to be more equitable? What are some of the policies and procedures that you may be considering or already implemented at the Chicago Community Trust?
Well, as mentioned earlier, we've really looked at being much more present with the communities that we work with. We have a part of our foundation that has a team of people who are really, their whole role is to be engaged with community, to work with community in partnership and build out the kind of coalitions within communities that really help to have community at the table, if you will. But, some of the things that I think people are doing, for instance, we ask people from communities to come and represent in all sorts of ways. Now, these are people who are leaving jobs to come downtown to spend 2 or 3 hours advising us on, what's going on in their communities. We should pay them for this. This is valuable time. How do we think about, if we think that their time is as valuable as some consultant that we're paying, top dollar per hour, we should also be thinking about how are we paying community leaders when we also ask them essentially to be consultants to us around community needs. So, I think things like that. I mentioned we do participatory grant making. Can you actually, we did recently what we called an open call for ideas, where we said, we've got some money that we want to invest in communities. Give us your best ideas about what would be most helpful, as opposed to us saying, here's our RFP and here's our nicely researched ideas that we have, and you respond to us. We ask them to tell us, what should we be asking of communities? How should we be thinking about the ideas that we propose? So I think there's, if you think about having an authentic partnership. And how would you work in partnership with somebody who you had equal respect for? I think it starts reshaping the way we think about it, as opposed to foundations as judge and jury. So I just think it takes that reset of thinking to develop a different kind of way of thinking about what we do. And I think, again, there's some practical things, like I mentioned, that I think, can help that. And also, I just think even having a policy that says explicitly that, we want to make sure our dollars are going to organizations that are led by people of color is important. And, some people actually have goals and targets and specific percentages that they want to spend. So, I think there are things like that too, where you can measure how well you're doing.
So when you were being courted to take the job at the Chicago Community Trust, did you know that you were going to be kind of instituting this more participatory process? You may have had some idea in terms of what changes you thought might be needed socially, but did kind of what were the things that surprised you, that you were surprised with, that was easier to do or more difficult to do when you came and joined the Community Foundation?
Yeah, I would say partly because, I'd spent 30 years or so working globally. I often say a lot of the ways in which we work internationally are lessons that we could learn here. And one of the biggest lessons of, my years working globally is that you listen to community. That, particularly as somebody coming into a country that's not my own, you learn to listen and take input from communities and learn to realize that, communities generally know what's best for their own communities. And if you just are willing to listen and then help support people in their own ideas and their own wisdom about their own communities, you usually do better than if you come in with some preconceived notion. And so when I came in, new to Chicago as well as new to the community foundation field, I took, almost a year to listen and learn. And I think that, and it wasn't just me, our whole foundation went on a, kind of a year of learning and listening, if you will. And I think because we took that posture of saying, we aren't coming saying we know what's best, we're coming with, open ears and a willingness to listen. I think a lot of the things that we then developed weren't as hard as they would have been otherwise.
Yeah, that's wise counsel, I think, to all of us starting new things. We have a question from Professor Perlberg related to.
Oh my.
Related to, I think, the wonderful energy around advocacy that we see the trust engaging in, and more of our philanthropic institutions, advocacy becoming important. She says, one of the common phrases used to describe community foundations is quote unquote neutral convener. However, as you increasingly take stances on key policy issues, you are no longer quote unquote neutral. How have you brought your board and donors along as you've engaged in policy and taken on these tough issues?
Yeah, what we try to do is lead with the data. And so, I think of ourselves less as neutral because I think it's important to have a point of view about things, but I think they should be guided by the best data and the best information, and that's not just studies, it's also, as I mentioned, the community. I think that's a data point, if you will. So I think it's, it's really well-informed policy making. And I think, what we have tried to do is now that we have our North Star, which is closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, really aligning our policy around issues that can impact our overall arching and our overall goal. So we're not, kind of picking and choosing policies based on, what's expedient for the moment, but we're really trying to be disciplined about how do we think about what policies will actually advance our goals of closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap, and how do we look at the policies where we think can make the biggest difference and have the greatest kind of lever for change as we're doing it. So I don't think that being willing to engage in policy and advocacy means that you lose your objectivity. I think you probably do have to lose some of your quote neutrality, but that does not mean that you're not still evidence-based, you're not still thinking about what will make the biggest difference and doing it in a rigorous way.
Yeah, so you have your North Star, and then everything is focused on, all the advocacy is focused on pushing that forward, right? Not
Right.
not in terms of picking winners or losers in the political game, right?
Exactly.
So that's terrific. Well, we've talked a lot about crisis, and you've seen crises in different fields from various vantage points. What do you see as kind of ingredients for institutional and kind of personal resilience in a crisis?
Being prepared is one thing, you know, and if we look at this crisis of the moment, unfortunately, we could have been more prepared and we weren't. And, you know, I think you go into a situation with the greatest amount of preparation, understanding, you know, what may be on the horizon. You know, for instance, we just finished doing our business continuity plan. You know, a lot of the things that we're looking at may never happen, but we're going to be prepared for them if they do. And I think it is in making sure that you are going into any situation, having thought through what, you know, what might happen, that you're able to withstand shocks and be resilient. So, you know, I think preparation is the best, you know, way to resilient proof in organization or even your own life.
Sure, sure. Well, sounds like a great public health response to me, you know. That's
Can't
absolutely
get far from my public health roots, you know,
so
prevention, you know.
that's absolutely true. Well, you know, we also, you know, have, you know, and community foundations are interesting because they're also, in addition to, you know, making grants and engaging the community by providing and marshaling resources, you also fundraise. And so we have quite a few fundraisers on the call right now. Can you tell us a little bit about how how fundraising has been during the crisis, and what do you see as the future for the trust as you plan for fundraising going forward and in the aftermath?
Yeah, you know, I think a few things. First of all, I've been incredibly impressed and gratified by how our donor base has really stepped up to this moment. I mean, you know, if we compare our giving last year to this year, you know, it has increased multifold. And so donors have really stepped up to the plate to show their generosity and show their support in this moment of need. And I think that will stand us in good stead for the long run. I think the fact that we were all, that, you know, that we leaned into this moment and were able to respond to the needs of our community, I think gives our donors confidence in us that, you know, we're an organization that really is there to walk with this community in a serious way through hard times as well as through good times. So I think, you know, in this moment, we saw our donor base respond incredibly, but I think it also, because of our response at this moment, gave them greater confidence in us and the direction that we're going in.
That's great. And often when we talk about fundraising community foundations, the issue of donor advised funds comes up, and the high profile of the big commercially connected Fidelities and the Schwabs and the Vanguards. So I'm imagining kind of the community embeddedness of the trust is something that's kind of coming more prominent now rather than the facility of making those transactions, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think people recognize how important it is to have an institution that doesn't just guard your money well and invest it well, but also invest in the community, which is why people come to a community foundation. And I think our knowledge of the community, and I think, you know, back to the earlier question, I think the fact that we have taken a stand on something that people recognize is an important issue to tackle here in our region, I think is attractive to our donor base as well. And so, you know, I think our not being totally neutral has actually been to our benefit, because I think people recognize how important this issue is and actually want to invest with us as we think about how we tackle this tough issue of closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap.
Have you had to deal with any criticism or pushback in terms of the clear focus that you've taken on?
I think we had concerns that there might be and there could be, but in fact, I think people have understood it, and there's been a great deal of support. And the way I like to explain it is that, as I said earlier on, if we're thinking about what's best for our region as a whole, and economic prosperity and moving ahead economically is critical for any region, you can't do that if you're holding 2/3 of your population back. And if we make it based on the math of this and the pure economic argument, along with the fact that, oh, by the way, it's also the right and fair and just thing to do, I think most people see the wisdom in looking at ways in which we can reduce this wealth gap. And it's been sustained, it's growing. And I think people are recognizing that it's holding us back economically as a region. And so with that, I think people really understand why this makes sense, and it makes sense for it to be our highest priority.
Sure. Yeah, so in some ways you were prepared to hopefully take advantage for the unfortunate reasons why we had this kind of racial awakening. You were kind of prepared to show people, what some of the solutions may be, right?
Yeah, and I think the fact that we had already put this strategy in place, it wasn't as if we were only speaking to the moment. This was something that we had already committed to, and I think people then recognized the importance of it even more.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, let me ask you, as we head toward the end of our time, kind of what you read, watch, do to make sense of what's happening in the world first, and then kind of what do you read, watch, or do to kind of unplug, or to not be overwhelmed by the rush of information?
Maybe I'm blessed by the fact that I love my work because if I didn't at this moment, where all of us are overconsumed with 10 zillion Zoom calls a day, and the frenetic pace that I think we're all on, I think we thought we might be getting a break, but in fact, I think our world is even sped up and accelerated. So, I guess I try to make sense of the world by not only staying in my bubble. I think it's important that we hear different points of view so that we can develop, a perspective on these issues that isn't just listening to people whose opinions or way of thinking is exactly like yours. So I try to stretch. I try to read a variety of different papers and listen to different news sources, talk to different people, because I think that is part of what we're lacking right now in the public discourse, is that ability to talk to each other and learn from each other and put together an idea of the world that's actually a blend of the way that the different perspectives that we all bring into this, and it's part of what helps me, I hope, be able to connect the dots in the work that we're doing is, by thinking about it from a variety of different perspectives. I'm reading a lot less fun stuff than I used to right now because, between this panel and the work that we're doing and all the rest of it, it's hard. But, trying to carve out a little bit more time for doing that and just watching fun TV from time to time.
Oh, cool. What do you watch? If I may ask, what's fun TV?
Oh, I'm trying to think of what, I get lots of great suggestions from people on different movies. I looked at a series recently that I love, Mrs. America. I don't know if you saw that, but it was all, I lived through that. So it was fascinating to go back to that era and see, some of those characters come alive. So, I'm just taking any suggestions that people have. I don't know if you've got watched anything that was particularly fun recently.
That was good. We watched, well, when my kids, before my kids went to college, we watched Hamilton together
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
on that. That was fun. So they could help me understand, interpret the new culture. So that's great.
Yeah, I saw Hamilton twice in the theaters here in Chicago and in New York. And I'm still going to want to go back because then I could listen to it and actually hear the lyrics perhaps better. A little fast for me, but anyway,
I know
I loved it. I loved it. Yeah,
it was amazing. It was
yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
Right. Well, it's nice to end on such a somewhat light note, but you've done us a great service in terms of sharing your wisdom and giving your approach to the public health challenges and the wonderful work that the Chicago Community Trust is doing and engaging in its community. So thank you for joining us and for enlightening us, Helene. It's been a treat. And I want to thank also our participants on Zoom who helped us explore perspectives on philanthropy. Please join us next on August 26th at noon Eastern Time, when we will be joined by Faye Twersky, Vice President of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And thank you all for participating, and please do stay safe. Thank you so much,
Thank
Helene.
you. Bye.
Bye.